Today I'm going to talk about astral projection, also known as astral travel. Those that follow my wife and myself, Jane and myself, on Facebook will see we recently did a chat about that, and there'll be a video up here on YouTube about that shortly too. But it inspired me to make a little bit more of a kind of more formal type of video about astral projection, and to teach a little bit about what it's all about and some of the ideas behind it. Now, I first came across this idea of astral projection when I was at school. Now let me explain. Astral projection is the idea that we travel outside of our body, and I'll talk about the way that happens and so forth later. But we have an we can have an out of body experience. Now, I got interested in this when I was actually at junior school in the so I was in the 50s, 1950. God, I'm looking old. Yeah, so right back then we had a teacher that had been stationed in Tibet. And in order to avoid maths and so forth lessons, we used to try to distract him. He was one of those teachers you could easily distract. So, as well as myself, the boys used to say, "Can you tell us a little bit about when you were in India, in Tibet, sir?" Right? Now, I think he was in Tibet rather than northern India, because he would have been there. Tibet was occupied in around 1950, I think it was. But he told me, and told us actually, about the monks that he met while in Tibet, who used to talk about cloud walking. And it really stuck in my mind. What was this cloud walking? And he described about how, it's going back a long time, but he described basically about how the monks would sit in meditation and be able to, what they called cloud walk, that is to travel outside of their body. So when the British Army people would connect with these in Tibet, they would know they were coming already. And when asked how did you know, they would say it was by cloud walking. One of our monks saw you while he was in the astral form. And these Buddhists, and in particular what's called the Bon, who are the endemic religion of Tibet that was there before Buddhism, really believed in this idea that you could travel outside of your body. And actually it's in most traditions around the world, if you look. I mean, in India, of course, there's a lot of talk about astral travel as well, astral projection. It was mentioned in Yogananda's books. He's talked about it a number of times. Read Yogananda if you've never read him. Brilliant autobiography of a yogi, and other books. They talk about a lot, and there's various traditions in India that specifically use techniques to travel out of the body. They use techniques such as mantra, in particular. A particular type of mantra that's said in meditation will put the person into a type of trance so they can travel outside of their body. Also, I was one of the first books that really sort of grabbed me about the idea of astral projection too was called The Secret of the Golden Flower. It's an old Taoist book. Absolutely beautiful title, I think. It's completely impossible to get your head around when you first read it. But it's only in recent years that I began to understand what it's about, which is basically it's a symbolic way of describing what we call we could call Kriya Yoga, a form of Kundalini Yoga, but it's put in deeply symbolic form. Okay, so basically this is an old alchemy book, The Secret of the Golden Flower, but its goal was to teach the adepts to develop what they called the diamond body, or the secret pearl was the other way of describing it, which could first travel round the body, and that's a little bit like yoga nidra type technique, nyasan techniques, but then to develop this golden body that could live, this diamond body that could live outside of the physical body. So it was kind of preparing a person perhaps for travel in the astral plane, and also this technique was used to develop this special spiritual body that could survive death. So with the death of the physical body, there was no need to incarnate again, because they developed such a powerful, subtle body, as it were, for the next life. That was my take on it. Anyway, others might talk differently about that. Carl Jung, in particular, talked about the secret of the golden flower as a representation of the integration of the self and the development of the individual. However, there isn't a lot of different things. It was even actually the idea of astral travel was also mentioned in the Bible, of all places. St. Paul, in his second epistle to the Corinthians, talked about the third heaven. Right, so there's this idea that there's another dimension as opposed to heaven itself. Now, a lot of the Theosophists drew on a lot of these old traditions. That, there was the traditions of Egypt that particularly influenced Theosophy. The idea that there's this ka, or subtle body, that can extend outside of the self. This was all in the Egyptian hieroglyphs and so forth. This idea of the ka that comes out of the human body at death and before. And like I said, I've talked about China, I've talked about India, I've talked that it was also the stories in Japan. The Indians have information about this. A lot of interesting, fascinating accounts that come from the Amazon rainforests about people that can not only travel outside of their body, but could travel in the souls of animals or take on an animal form when they step outside the body. So there's a vast field. But it became popularised here in the West really through Theosophy. Now the most important person, I suppose, in Theosophy was Madame Blavatsky, an unusual, strange woman who, like me, was inspired by India and the old ancient Indian traditions. I don't agree with a lot of what she says. I think her take has been mistaken on some of the things that she's seen in India. But let's face it, she was one of the first to go there. They didn't have the internet to do research, and they didn't even have the books to do much research on India. That was a really new thing to the Theosophists. But she became particularly interested in this idea that the soul can travel outside of the body. And astral travel has now become much more mainstream word. A lot of you would have heard of this word, would know about it. But then in the when would that she have been working? I suppose 1930s, I suppose she was. I'm not sure, might be wrong. But it was at the time in the advent of spiritualism at the same time, which came up with lots of different ideas about travelling outside the body, because people were beginning to sort of rebel against Darwinism. Darwin said that, the body was the only thing that is real, and that there is no such thing as a soul. It's all mechanical universe that is all determined by billions of years of evolution. And they were proving that the Earth had been there billions of years because geology was proving this at the time. And there was a real crisis at the time. So this mysticism that developed in things like Theosophy and Spiritualism was a reaction against the Darwinian idea that we were nothing more than a mechanical being determined by evolution. They were looking at it the other way round and saying, well, yes, perhaps evolution can create the physical body, but it can't create the soul or the mind. These are separate things, and the spirit works through the body, and the spirit too, consciousness itself, could even be evolving. People like Nietzsche were putting the ideas like this in some respects. The idea of eternal recurrence was an interesting idea. Gurdjieff came up with similar ideas to this, as did Rudolf Steiner, that the spirit and the soul is somehow evolving and steps from one body into others. So the whole idea of reincarnation was being brought to the West because of this as well. So this whole idea of astral travel has become much more mainstream, but we can see it, like I said, in all the stories that go back through history. The Roman times, the story of the Roman soldier that was called I think his name was, who had an out-of-body experience when he was put on the when they tried to execute him. There's so many stories that it makes you think this is a real thing. Now, any of you that have had an out-of-body experience will understand that this is far from fantasy. This is very much a real experience. My own experience, as I've talked about, you'll see if you go and look up the one with me and Jane talking, my first experience of it was as a young fellow of about 14 years old, because I got interested in these things so early on, like I've described the junior school influence and then, the rest of it. Around about 14, and a lot of people have this around that sort of age, adolescent age. I had this experience of stepping outside of my body, looking down and seeing my body. And when I realised that I was out of my body, it was sort of a panic set in, and I went bang, like a snap of a whip as I came back into the body. Woke up drenched in sweat, shaking like a leaf. But I had had an experience where I'd seen myself dead on the bed, as it were, as I thought at the time. And of course I started to look into it and find out what's this all about. And there were books around like Lobsang Rampa at the time that were coming out that kind of gave a stupid but a bit of an understanding of what these things were about. And only years later does one begin to realise what these things are, and people nowadays fortunately can find out about these things by doing just a little bit of research. So it happens to me, it happens to you, it probably happens for most people like in a sleep state, in a dream state, and that point between sleeping and waking where we can encounter a point where we can step between these two worlds, into this world that some say is neither heaven nor earth. It's an in-between astral state between the two, and through that you can also enter the etheric world, as it were, that you can enter the worlds where time is different. This is where the idea of the Akashic record comes in. This is the idea that there is an eternal library of knowledge, as it were, and a blueprint, a memory, a hard drive that has all of the knowledge of whatever's happened, and that by accessing these astral planes, we simultaneously can look through time, both forward and back. This is something obviously that I've been experimenting with a lot, with my predictions that I've made and so forth, but also have an interest in the deep past, and sometimes how you can connect through things like psychometry in the waking life, but sometimes in sleep into these incredible worlds of at the astral plane. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to make another video to explain how one accesses and gets into that state of consciousness, and how to actually have what we could loosely call an astral projection experience. I have discovered a secret oracle in India that has on it the name of my mother, the name of my father, my name, my brother's name, my wife's name, all the details about my life from the moment I was born and right into the future. And it even tells me the time of my death. And to access this oracle, all it needed was my thumbprint.